Just to get a glimpse beyond the illusion by TinyButFierce. Chapter 5. Ticking of a clock sounded from TVs all over. The clock faded into the background and the view became one of a reporter sitting in front of a giant book with the title, A New Era, Meeting the Stark Heir, and a photo of Peter Parker and Tony Stark sitting on a couch and talking to someone animatedly, smiles on both their faces. The reporter smiled at the camera and, with the classic 60 Minutes professional tone of voice, addressed the audience. Good evening, and welcome to the last story of this week's episode of 60 Minutes. We tend to take more time to research events before broadcasting a story, but for these two we made an exception. Recently, WHIH News released a story that revealed the identity of the new heir to Stark Industries, ignoring the plea for respect that the company has asked for when an announcement about an heir was released. Soon afterwards, SI released a statement that an interview would be released to the public soon. That interview, tonight. The picture on the screen changed to a video of the reporter walking into Stark Tower with the camera crew behind her. The glass doors opened up and the view of an elegant modern lobby was shown. An elevator dinged and a greeting was heard coming from the other direction. It turned to show Tony Stark strutting forward with his signature goatee and sunglasses, a smile on his face, and an AC/DC shirt with a blazer thrown over it. He reached out his hand and shook the hand of the reporter who had come to the tower. Waving at the camera crew, he turned them in the direction of the elevators. The view changed to one of Tony Stark and Peter Parker sitting on a couch with the view of a tastefully decorated wall with a fireplace behind them. Tony's sunglasses had come off, and he had an arm nonchalantly slung around the back of the couch. Peter was glancing around awkwardly, sitting a little forward, wearing a shirt that said, "I may be nerdy, but only periodically," with nerdy written out via the elements of the periodic table. The view changed to the reporter. "Well, to start this out, I love the shirt. It's hilarious." Peter looked down and laughed. He turned to look at Tony with a searching gaze. The billionaire gave him an imperceptible nod, and the teen turned to look at the reporter with a smile on his face. "It's one of my favourites. Tony tried to make us wear matching three-piece suits, but Pepper stopped that disaster fast." Tony frowned good-humouredly, with a twinkle in his eye. "It would have been legendary. It would have been something." "Hey!" The reporter laughed. "You two seem rather comfortable with each other." Tony snorted. "I just got him to stop calling me Mr. Stark." Peter smiled but didn't deign to comment. The reporter continued. "Well, for my first question, Peter, what are your feelings around the recent reveal of your identity?" The teen frowned and shifted on the couch. "I guess I knew deep down that it would come out eventually. I guess I thought that I'd be able to do it on my own terms once I was out of school. I mean, if it had happened that way, I would have totally done a giant imitation of Tony's I am Iron Man speech. I'd stand up at a podium with a bunch of cue cards, dramatically throw them over my shoulder, and then in the Batman voice just say, 'I'm the Stark heir,' and then I would do a mic drop and walk out." Peter took a deep breath, as he hadn't done so at all during his ramble. Tony stared at him incredulously. "If that's what you were planning, I'm actually glad that it happened the way it did. It would have been incredible." The view turned back to the reporter, smiling and glancing between the two as they continued their back and forth. She began the next question. "So, how did the two of you meet?" Tony glanced at Peter and took the question. "The first time I met Peter, well, met is the wrong term. We first interacted at the 2010 Stark Expo. Yes, one." The billionaire paused and turned to Peter with his eyebrows raised. Peter looked at him questioningly for a second before realizing that he was passing it to the teen. "Oh yeah, so I had on an Iron Man mask and gauntlet, the ones that people would get for Halloween, and one of the hammer drones tried to kill me, but Tony landed next to me and shot the drone. He then proceeded to look at me and say, 'Nice work, kid,' and we flew off. It was the greatest moment of my young life." Tony took over from there. "So, long story short, I remember the incident and did some research to see if the kid made it out okay. I ended up at one of his science fairs looking for potential SI innovators and recognised him. Turns out that not only is this kid a genius, but he also helps out a mutual friend of ours, Spider-Man, with his webbing. I brought him into the compound to give him better equipment and ended up getting attached. The reporter smiled. That certainly is a fantastic story. Dr. Stark, where do you think this will bring my company? Tony started to answer the question while Peter zoned out a bit and started making reaction faces directly into the camera. Tony paused and looked over in confusion at the teen. What are you doing? Peter paused. I'm practicing. In the office, they turn to the camera and are able to communicate all their feelings with just one look. I'm working on that. Tony continued to stare as he nervously laughed. Then he turned to look directly at the camera and gave it a deadpan look before sighing and looking back at his protege. At least it wasn't a vine this time. Peter gasped, and Tony put his face in his hands. You got the name right this time. I'm so proud of you. I'm slowly making you aware of Gen Z and millennial culture. Yes! Tony stared at the reporter and spoke with an annoyed tone. He put lemons inside my cereal boxes. He attacked pigeons on the balcony with a hose, yelling about how it wasn't their land. Those are only 2 examples of the things I've had to put up with. Peter snorted. It's necessary for your education. You called a dab a dap the other day. Tony sighed and Peter tapped him on the arm. Hey, how did you take down Captain America? Tony sighed again, closed his eyes and replied, We shot him in the legs because his shield is the size of a dinner plate and he's an idiot. Peter raised his hands in triumph as Tony tried to cover up a smile. The view transitioned to the reporter sitting in front of the large book again. She smiled at the camera. As many of you know, the Avengers have only recently gotten back together after the events that have been titled the Avengers Civil War over the Sokovia Accords. While at Stark Tower, I took the opportunity to ask both Dr. Stark and Mr. Parker about their experience with the conflict. While Dr. Stark chose not to respond to the question, pointing me towards the official press releases, Mr. Parker, however, had an interesting insight into the conflict. The camera was shown pointing at Peter, plainly missing from the couch. The teen flicked his eyes to the corner of the room and fidgeted before looking back at the reporter. I guess the Sokovia Accords situation was interesting for me because we've been following it in my current events class, and I was able to see, close, the situation with the Avengers. The perspective allowed me to be able to look at it objectively as well as emotionally. I feel that the reason it went south fast was no one really talked it out with each other, and by the time it had finished, no one wanted to talk it out because everyone was hurt in more ways than one. The reporter nodded and gestured her pen at him. Do you think that, with plans for the Avengers, the conflict may be resolved? Peter frowned and thought about the question for a second before slowly nodding. I don't think that it will ever go back to the way it was, but I do think that, if they think about the context of everyone's reactions and hash it out, some semblance of the way it was may be achievable. The video of Peter faded into the background as the photo on the book with the reporter in front. She clasped her hands together. Wise words from a teen with a very large future in front of him. This brings us to the end of today's broadcast. Visit 60 Minutes Overtime to hear our interview with the CEO of SI, Pepper Potts, on the future of Stark Industries and how Mr. Parker might shape it. This has been 60 Minutes. The titular clock appeared and the ticking started to play. The last tick sounded and it faded from the screens. The beginning of a new era.